Good evening, everybody. 9 o'clock on the dot. Ready to read a little bit more of The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. Kind of a weird day today. Weird weather. Kind of weird. I don't know, just a weird feeling all day, but I'm glad to be here with everybody and I'm glad to do some reading and let us listen to Mr. Martin butcher some Lithuanian names. We'll give it another minute or so and let some more people jump online, and then we'll get started. All right. So last night when we left off, the wedding was wrapping up, and everyone was pretty drunk and anxious and kind of realizing in the back of their head that at some point they got to go to work, and if they're late, they're going to get in trouble. So little Ona is nearly ready to faint and half in a stupor herself because of the scent of the room. She had not taken a drop, but everyone else was literally burning alcohol, as the lamps are burning oil. Some of the men who are sound asleep in their chairs or on the floor are reeking of it, excuse me, so that you cannot go near them. Now and then Jorgis gazes at her hungrily. He has long forgotten his shyness, but then the crowd is there, and he still waits and watches the door where a carriage is supposed to come. It does not, and finally he will wait no longer. He comes up to Ona, who turns white and trembles. He puts her shawl about her and then his own coat. They live only a few blocks away, and Jorgis does not care about the carriage. There is almost no farewell. The dancers do not notice them, and all the children and many of the old folks have fallen asleep of sheer exhaustion. Didi Antanas is asleep, and so are the Svedviliases, husband and wife, the former snoring in octaves. There is Teta and Marija sobbing loudly. Then there is only the silent night, with the stars beginning to pale a little in the east. Jorgis, without a word, lifts Anna in his arms and strides out with her, and she sinks her head upon his shoulder with a moan. When he reaches home, he is not sure whether she has fainted or is asleep, but when he has to hold her with one hand while he unlocks the door, he sees that she has opened her eyes. You shall not go to Brown's today, little one, he whispers as he climbs the stairs, and she catches his arm in terror, gasping, No, no, I dare not. It will ruin us. But he answers her again, Leave it to me, leave it to me. I will earn more money. I will work harder. Chapter 2. Jorgis lately about work. Jorgis talked lately about work because he was young. They told him stories about the breaking down of men there in the stockyards of Chicago, and of what have happened to them afterwards. Stories to make your flesh creep. But Jorgis would only laugh. He had only been there for months. He had only been there 4 months, and he was young, and a giant besides. There was too much health in him. He could not even imagine how it would feel to be beaten. That is well enough for men like you, he would say. Silpnas, puny fellows, but my back is broad. Jorgis was like a boy from the country. He was the sort of man that bosses like to get a hold of, and the sort they make it a grievance they cannot hold off. When he was told to go to a certain place, he would go there on the run. When he had nothing to do for the moment, he would stand around fidgeting, dancing, with the overflow of energy that was in him. If he were working in a line of men, the line always moved too slowly for him, and you could pick him out by his impatience and restlessness. That was why he had been picked on, and on more than one occasion. For Jorgis had stood outside of Brown and Company's Central Time Station not more than half an hour, the second day of his arrival in Chicago, before he had been beckoned by one of the bosses. Of this he was very proud, and it made him more disposed than ever to laugh at the pessimists. In vain they would all tell him that they were the men in the front of the crowd, which he had been chosen, who had stood there a month. Yes, many months, and not been chosen yet. Yes, he would say. But what sort of men? Broken down tramps, or good for nothings, fellows who have spent all their money drinking, and want to get more for it. Do you want me to believe that with these arms? And he would clench his fists and hold them in the air, so that you might see his rolling muscles. That with these arms people would ever let me starve. It is plain, they would answer to this, that you have come from the country, and from very far in the country. And this was the fact, for Jorgis had never seen a city, and scarcely a fair-sized town, until he had set out to make his fortune in the world and earn his right to Ona. His father and his father's father before him, and as many ancestors back to legend could go, had lived in the part of Lithuania known as Brelovitz, the imperial forest. This is a great tract of 100,000 acres, which from the immemorial had been a hunting preserve of the nobility. There are very few peasants settled in it, holding title from ancient times, and one of these as the Antaras Rudkus, who had been reared himself, and he had reared his children in turn upon a dozen acres of cleared land in the midst of the wilderness. There, there had been one of his sons besides Jorgis, and one sister. The former had been drafted into the army, that had been over 10 years ago. But since that day, nothing had ever been heard of him. The sister was married, and her husband had bought the place when old Antanas had decided to go with his son. It was nearly a year and a half ago that Jorgis had met Ona, and a horse fair 100 miles from home. Jorgis had never expected to be married. He had laughed at it as a foolish trap for men to walk into. But here, without ever having spoken a word to her, with no more than the exchange of half a dozen smiles, he found himself, purple in the face with embarrassment and terror, asking her parents to sell her to him for his wife, and offering his father's 2 horses he had been sent to the fair to sell. But Ona's father proved as a rock. The girl was yet a child, and he was a rich man. His daughter was not to be had in that way. So Jorgis went home with a heavy heart, and that spring and summer toiled and tried hard to forget. In the fall, after the harvest was over, he saw that it would not do, and he tramped the full fortnight's journey that lay between him and Ona. He found an unexpected state of affairs, for the girl's father had died, and his estate was tied up with creditors. Jorgis's heart leaped as he realized that now the prize was within reach. There, the Elisabetta Luciette, Teta, or aunt, as they called her, Ona's stepmother, And there were her 6 children of all ages. There was also her brother Jonas, a dried up little man who had worked upon the farm. There were people of great consequence, as it seemed to Jorgis, fresh out of the woods. Ona knew how to read, and knew many other things that he did not know. And now the farm had been sold, and the whole family was adrift. All they owned in the world was about 700 rubles, which is as half as many dollars. They would have had 3 times that, but had gone to court, and the judge had decided against them, and and it had cost the balance to get him to change his decision. Ona might have married and left them, but she would not, for she loved Teta. It was Jonas who suggested that they all go to America, where a friend of his had gotten rich. He would work for his part, and the woman would work, and some of the children, doubtless. They would live somehow. Jorgis, too, had heard of America. That was a country where, they said, a man might earn 3 rubles a day, and Jorgis figured what 3 rubles a day would mean, with prices as they were where he lived, and decided forthwith that he would go to America and marry, and be a rich man in the bargain. Excuse me. In that country, rich or poor, a man was free, it was said. He did not have to go into the army. He did not have to pay out his money to rascally officials. Excuse me. He might do as he pleased and count himself as good as any other man. So America was a place of which lovers and young people dreamed, if one could only manage to get to the price of a passage. It could count his troubles in the end. So, what are they talking about here? When we talked about immigration, we said that there were 2 waves of immigration: the old immigrants and the new immigrants. Jorgis and Ona and her family are new immigrants. They're coming from Eastern Europe. So they're that second wave of immigrants. But we also talked about push-pull forces. So there are corrupt officials, there are corrupt judges, there's corrupt politicians. There's not a lot there for them. So it's worth it for them to risk that journey to America. They're being pushed out of their country of origin, and they're being pulled to a land where they believe that anybody can become rich. And that's what immigration, at least during this time, is all about: push pull forces. It was arranged that they should leave the following spring. In meantime, Jorgis sold himself to a contractor for a certain time. He tramped nearly 400 miles from home with a gang of men to work upon the railroad at Smolensk. This was a fearful experience, with filth and bad food and cruelty and overwork. But Jorgis stood it and came out in fine trim, with 80 rubles sewed up into his coat. He did not drink or fight because he was thinking the whole time of Ona. And for the rest, he was quite a steady man who did what he was told. He did not lose his temper often, and when he did lose it, it made the offender anxious that he should not lose it again. When he paid him off, he dodged the company gamblers and dram shops, and so they tried to kill him. But he escaped and tramped at home, working at odd jobs and sleeping away with one eye open. So in the summertime, they had all set out for America. At the last moment, they were joined by Mareja, who was the cousin of Ona's. Mareja was an orphan and had worked since childhood for a rich farmer of Vilna, who beat her regularly. It was only at the age of 20 that it occurred to Mareja to try her strength, when she had risen up and nearly murdered the man, and then she came away. There were 12 in the party, 5 adults, 6 children, and Ona, who was a little of both. They had a hard time on the passage. There was an agent who helped them, but he proved a scoundrel. He got them into a trap with some officials, and it cost them a good deal of their precious money, which they clung to with such horrible fear. This happened to them again in New York, for, of course, they knew nothing about the country and had no one to tell them. It was easy for a man in a blue uniform to lead them away and to take them to a hotel and keep them there, and make them pay enormous charges to get away. The law says that a rate card shall be at the door of the hotel, but it does not always say it shall be in Lithuanian. It was in the stockyards that Jonas's friend had gotten rich, and so to Chicago the party was bound. They knew that one word, Chicago, and that was all they needed to know, at least, until they reached the city. Then, tumbled out of the cars without ceremony, they were no better off than before. They stood staring down the vista of Dearborn Street, with its big black buildings towering in the distance, unable to realize that they had arrived and why. When they said Chicago, people no longer pointed in some direction, but instead looked perplexed or laughed or went on without paying any attention. They were pitiable in their helplessness. Above all things, they stood in deadly terror of any sort of person in an official uniform. And so, wherever they saw a policeman, they would cross the street and hurry by. For the whole of the first day, they wandered about in the midst of a deafening crowd, utterly lost. And it was only at that night, cowering in the doorway of a house, they were finally discovered and taken by a policeman to the station. In the morning, an interpreter was found, and they were taken and put upon a car and taught a new word, stockyards. Their delight at discovering that they were to get out of this adventure without losing another share of their possessions, it would not be possible to describe. They sat and stared out of the window. They were on a street which seemed to run forever, mile after mile, 34 of them, if they had known it, and each side, of it, an interrupted row of wretched two-story frame buildings. Down every side street they could see, it was the same. Never a hill and never a hollow, but always the same endless vista of ugly and dirty little wooden buildings. Here and there would be a bridge crossing a filthy creek, with a hard-baked mud stores and dingy sheds and docks along it. Here and there would be a railroad crossing with a tangle of switches and locomotives puffing and rattling freight cars filing by. Here and there would be a great factory, a dingy building with innumerable windows on it, and immense volumes of smoke pouring out of the chimneys, darkening the air above and making filthy the earth beneath. But after each of these interruptions, the desolate procession would begin again. Procession would begin again. The procession of dreary little buildings. So, again, in class we talked about, New York City, Chicago, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Boston, beautiful cities to go visit. Not at this time, okay? Again, no sewers, millions of people living in these, 2, 3-story wooden houses, no air conditioning, no plumbing, no running water. No, thank you, right? No, thank you, people. This was disgusting, but it was a better place for them to live. In the midst of all that are factories. So junk is pouring out into the air. Whatever's not pouring out into the air, they're dumping out into the streets or these little rivers. A full hour before the party reached the city, they had begun to note the perplexing changes in the atmosphere. It grew darker all the time, and upon the earth the grass seemed to grow less green. Every minute as the train sped on, the colors of things became dingier. The fields were grown parched and yellow, the landscape hideous and bare. And along with the thickening smoke, they began to notice another circumstance, a strange, pungent odor. Here we go. They were not sure that it was unpleasant, this odor. Some might have called it sickening, but their taste in odors was not developed, and they were only sure that it was curious. Now, sitting in the trolley car, they realized that they were on their way to the home of it, and that they had traveled all the way from Lithuania to it. It is now no longer something far off and faint that you could catch in whiffs. You could literally taste it and smell it, and you could take hold of it, almost examine it at your leisure. They were divided in their opinion about it. It was an elemental odor, raw and crude. It was rich, almost rancid, sensual and strong. There were some who drank it in as if it was an intoxicant. There were others who put their handkerchiefs on their faces. The new emigrants were still tasting it, lost in wonder, when suddenly the car came to a halt, and the door was flung open and a voice shouted, "Stockyards!" They were left standing upon the corner, staring down a side street, and there were 2 rows of brick houses, and between them a vista, half a dozen chimneys, tall as the tallest building, touching the very sky, and leaping from them a half dozen columns of smoke, thick, oily, black as night. It might have come from the center of the world, this smoke, where the fires of the ages still smoldered. It came as if self propelled, driving all before it, a perpetual explosion. It was inexhaustible. One stared, waiting to see it stop, but still the great streams rolled on. They spread the vast clouds overhead, writhing, curling, then uniting into one giant river. They streamed away down the sky, stretching a black pall as far as the eye could see. Then the party became aware of another strange thing. This, too, like the color, was a thing elemental. It was a sound made up of 10,000 little sounds. You scarcely noticed it at first. It sunk into your consciousness. A vague disturbance, a trouble. It was like the murmuring of bees in the spring, the whispering of the forest. It suggested endless activity, the rumblings of a world in motion. It was only by an effort that one could realize that it was made by animals, that it was the distant lowing of 10,000 cattle, the distant grunting of 10,000 swine. They would have liked to follow it up, but alas, they had no time for adventures just then. The policemen on the corner were beginning to watch them, and so, as usual, they started up the street. Scarcely had they gone a block, however, before Jonas was heard to give a cry, and began pointing excitedly down the street. Before they could gather the meaning of his breathless ejaculations, he had bounded away, and they saw him enter a shop, over which was a sign, Je Civilis Delicatessen. When he came out again, it was in company of a very stout gentleman with shirt sleeves and an apron, clasping Jonas by both hands and laughing hilarious. Then Teta Elzbieta recollected suddenly that Sved Vilas had been the name of a mythical friend who had made his fortune in America. To find that he had been making it in a delicatessen business was an extraordinary piece of good fortune at this juncture. Though it was well into the morning, they had not breakfast, and the children were beginning to whimper. Thus was unhappy ending to a woeful voyage. The 2 families literally fell upon each other's necks, for it had been years since Jokubas had met a man from his part of Lithuania. Before half the day, they were lifelong friends. Jokubas understood all the pitfalls of this new world, and he could explain all of its mysteries. He could tell them the things they ought to have done in the different emergencies, and what was still more to the point, he could tell them what to do now. He would take them to Pony and Nell, who kept a boarding house on the other side of the yards. Old Miss Juknieni, he explained, had not what one would call choice accommodations, but they might do for the moment. To this, Teta hastened to respond that nothing could be too cheap to suit them just then, for they were quite terrified over the sums that they had to expend. A very few days of practical experience in this land of high wages had been sufficient to make it clear to them the cruel fact that it was also a land of high prices, and that in the poor man was almost as poor as any other corner of the earth. And so there vanished in the night all the wonderful dreams of wealth that had been haunting Jorgis. What had made the discovery all the more painful was that they were spending at American prices, money which they had earned at home or at home rates of wages, and so were really beginning to be cheated by the world. The last 2 days they had all but starved themselves. It made them quite sick to pay the prices that the railroad people asked them for food. Yet, when they saw the home of the widow Yunknieni, they could not but recoil. Even so, in all their journey, they had seen nothing so bad as this. And Yeli had a 4-room flat in one of that wilderness of two-story frame tenements that lie back of the yards. There were four such flats in each building, and each of the four was a boarding house for the occupancy of foreigners, Lithuanians, Poles, Slovaks, Bohemians. Some of these places were kept by private persons. Some were cooperative. There would be an average of a half dozen boarders in each room. Sometimes there were 13 or 14 to a room, 40 or 60 to a flat. Each one of the occupants furnished his own accommodations. That is, a mattress and some bedding. The mattresses would be spread upon the floor in rows, and there would be nothing else in this place except a stove. It was by no means unusual for two men to own the same mattress in common, one working by day and using it by night, the other working by night and using it in the daytime. Very frequently, a lodging house keeper would rent the same beds to double shifts of men. No, thank you. 13, 14 people living in a room. You sleep in a bed during the day, somebody else is sleeping in the bed during the night. No, thank you. And this was better from where they came from. This is why these people worked so hard, because they wanted to get out of these conditions. Mrs. Yonknieni was a wizened up little woman with a wrinkled face. Her home was unthinkably filthy. You could not enter by the front door at all, owing to the mattresses, and when you tried to go up to the back stairs, you found that she had walled up most of the porch with old boards to make the place to keep her chickens. It was a standing jest of all the boarders that Agnelli cleaned house by letting the chickens loose in the rooms. Undoubtedly, this did keep down the vermin, but it seemed probable in the view of circumstances that the old lady regarded it rather as feeding the chickens than as cleaning the rooms. The truth that she had definitely given up the idea of cleaning anything under pressure of an attack of rheumatism, which had kept her doubled up in one corner of her room for over a week, during which time 11 of her boarders, heavily in her debt, had concluded to try their chances of employment in Kansas City. This was July, and the fields were green. One never saw the fields nor any green thing wherever in Packingtown. But one could go out to the road and hobo it, as the men phrased it, and see the country, have a long rest, and at least time riding on the freight cars. Such was the home to which the new arrivals were welcomed. There were nothing better to be had. They might not do as well by looking further, for Mrs. Yonknieni had at least kept one room for herself and her three little children, now offered to share this with the women and the girls of the party. They could get bedding at a second-hand store, she explained, and they would not need any while the weather was so hot. Doubtless they would all sleep on the sidewalk such nights as this, and did nearly all of her guests. Tomorrow, Jorgis said, when they were left alone. Tomorrow I will get a job, and perhaps Jonas will come along also. And then we can get a place of our own. So it's so hot in the buildings that you're going to go sleep on the sidewalks at night. No, thank you. Later that afternoon, this is me commenting, not me reading. Later that afternoon, he and Ona went out to take a walk and look about them, to see more of the district which was to be their home. In backs of the yards, the dreary two-story frame houses were scattered farther apart, and there were great spaces of bareness, that seemingly had been overlooked by the great sore of the city as it spread itself over the surface of the prairie. These bare places were grown up with dingy yellow weeds, hiding innumerable tomato cans, innumerable children playing among them, chasing one another here and there, screaming and fighting. The most uncanny thing about this neighborhood was the number of children. You thought there must be school just out, and it was only after long acquaintance that you were able to realize that there was no school, but that these children were of the neighborhood, that there were so many children to the block in Packingtown that nowhere on its streets could a horse and buggy move faster than a walk. That's what my mom used to do. Hey, go out and play in the tomato cans all day. That's how I grew up. That's what it was like in Albany. It could not move faster anyhow, an account of the state of the streets. Those through which Jorgis and Ona were walking resembled streets less they did in a miniature topographical map. The roadway was commonly several feet lower than the level of the houses, which were sometimes joined by high boardwalks. There was no pavements. There were mountains and valleys and rivers, gullies and ditches, the great hollows full of stinking green water. In these pools, the children played and rolled about in the mud of the streets. Here and there, one noticed them digging in it, after trophies which they had stumbled upon. One wondered about this, as also about the swarms of flies which hung about the scene, literally blackening the air, the strange, fetid odor, which assailed one's nostrils, a ghastly odor of all the land, and that it had been made by using it as a dumping ground for city garbage. After a few years, the unpleasant effect of this would pass away, it was said. But meantime, in hot weather, and especially when it rained, the flies were apt to be annoying. Was it not unhealthful? The stranger would ask, and the residents would answer, perhaps, but there is no telling. So, go play in the tomato cans out by the green pools of water where they're digging up little treasures because this used to be the garbage pit for the town. Awesome. A little farther, let's read one more page. A little farther on, Jorgis and Anna, staring open wide and wondering, came to a place where this made ground was in the process of making. Here was a great hole, perhaps 2 city blocks square, with long files of garbage wagons creeping onto it. The place had an odor of which no polite words, and it was sprinkled over with children who raked in from dawn till dark. Sometimes visitors from the packing houses would wander out to see the dump. They would stand by and debate whether the children were eating the food they got or merely collecting it for the chickens at home. Apparently, none of them ever went down to find out. Beyond the dump, there stood a great brickyard with smoking chimneys. First, they took they took out the soil to make the bricks. Then they filled it up again with garbage, which seemed to Jorgis and Ona a fallacious arrangement, characteristic of the enterprising country like America. A little way beyond was another great hole. Oh, excuse me. Which they had emptied and not yet filled up. But this held water, and all summer it stood there, with a nearby soil draining into it, festering and stewing in the sun. And then, when winter came, somebody cut the ice on it and sold it to the people of the city. This too, oh, oh, this too seemed to the newcomers an economical arrangement. So they're basically building out the city, dumping all this garbage, filling up these holes. And now, when the holes that are filled with garbage and water ice over, somebody cuts up the ice and brings it into the city to sell it to people so that they can keep their stuff cold. This too seemed for the newcomers an economical arrangement, for they did not read the newspapers, and their heads were not full of troublesome thoughts about germs. One more paragraph, and we're done with this chapter. Excuse me. They stood there while the sun went down upon the scene, and the sky in the west turned blood red. The tops of the houses shone like fire. Jorgis and Ona were not thinking about the sunset, however. Their backs were turned to it. All their thoughts were on Packingtown, which they could see so plainly in the distance. The line of buildings stood clear-cut and black against the sky. Here and there, out of the mass, rose the great chimneys, with the great river of smoke streaming away to the end of the world. It was a study in colors now. This smoke and the sunset light. It was black and brown and gray and purple. All the sordid suggestions of the place were gone. In the twilight, it was a vision of power. To the two who stood, watching while the darkness swallowed it up, it seemed a dream of wonder, with its talc of human energy and of things being done, of employment of thousands upon thousands of men, of opportunity and freedom, of life and love and joy. When they came away arm in arm, Jorgis was saying, "Tomorrow I shall go there and get a job." Nice. We got another chapter done tonight. This is weird bookmarking on the Kindle. Nice. We're cruising through. So, yeah, the beautiful forests of Lithuania. We're going to go because of the corruption, because of the politics, because of the abuse. We're going to travel and risk everything to go to America, to where you can send your kids out to play in the tomato cans and the garbage. Awesome. Anywho, I hope everybody's doing well, my friends. I don't have a ton of news tonight. I've got, I don't think a lot of things have really changed. And there were two questions from last night. And I'm still doing research on, I'm technically still doing research on two of them. But, last night I believe somebody asked about the Spanish regents and that equivalency test. And I couldn't find out any information. I had texted a couple of the Spanish teachers, and they still don't know yet. So I'm not 100% sure if that is going to be one of those classes that are where you're not going to have to take that final. That's just a special kind of thing. So we'll see. The other thing, and my son is big into the news, and I talked to him about it, about these English cell towers. And I honestly, I didn't spend a lot of time kind of searching around for this, but I'm still waiting to see about this 5G. And I'm not too sure where all that's coming from. But we'll continue to dig it up. What we know today, my friends, is that over 150,000 New Yorkers have now tested positive. And again, today we've seen another 24-hour total number of deaths that has broken the record from the previous 24 hours. So when I checked earlier today, that 24-hour number was 778 people died in that time. And the number of people now has almost reached 6,300 people in the state that have passed away. So one of the things that we've been talking about is stimulus and helping people get their money, and people that are getting laid off. How is the state going to right now? And I think we already talked about this. Right around April 15th, those the money's going to get put into accounts, which is cool. And then if you're getting a check mailed to you, it's going to be around April 24th, and that hasn't changed. It looks like that's still going to happen. So that's early next week. But what the state government is now saying that they're going to do is this: if you've lost your job and you collect unemployment, right? And we've talked about unemployment before. You now in New York State can collect it for 39 weeks. The max payout is $504 a week. However, all New Yorkers that are going to go on unemployment are going to get an additional a one-time $600 I don't want to call it bonus, but additional payment. So, in the next couple of weeks, we're looking at people that have been unemployed that could potentially be getting maybe $2,000. So, again, in the big scheme of things, you have a family of four, $2,000. That's pretty good money. But over a month, that's it's not going to get you everywhere you need to go. But it'll certainly be a good start. It will be a good start. And always, as I remind you, questions, comments, concerns, throw them up there, my friends. Don't be shy. So what I guess the federal government is saying is, and let me back up a little bit, right? Let me back up. Let's talk about unemployment, right? Because again, I think this is one of those things that people don't truly understand. When you start working, you are going to, through the payroll taxes that are deducted in your check, you and your employer pay into that unemployment fund, even when you're not even technically, even when you can't even collect it, you're still paying into it. You have to work so many hours. You have to work, and we talked about that a while ago. So many hours over such a period of time, and you have to have earned so much money. And it's not a lot. It's not a ton of money. But you're paying into an insurance policy, right? So just like when you get your car, you pay for insurance. It's in case you get into an accident. If you get into the accident, Flo cuts you the check, you repair your car. So people that are getting unemployment, and again, I hear this a lot. All these deadbeats on unemployment, they're not doing anything. Well, right now, I'm not going to defend them, and maybe some people do sit on their butts, but what are they going to do, right? Here's the problem, and here's the challenge with unemployment. If, let's say that I became unemployed and I went and I got unemployment, and somebody said to me, hey, listen, I can give you 2 days worth of work, right? And I went and I did that 2 days worth of work. Well, guess what? That week, I can't collect unemployment. So in other states, the amount of money that you might make in New York is going to be able to go farther than if you took all of that money and then you were living in Wisconsin, let's say, I don't know, or you're living in Nebraska, right? Even in the money that you make in New York City, it always amazes me where I work, the farm that I work at in the summertime, right? We have these 5-pound jugs of honey, and they're $40 each, a jug of honey, right? And we get these people that, drive up and down through the Catskills, and they come by the farm and they, go, how much is that jug of honey? Oh, it's $40. And they go, $40? Can I buy 10 of them? Right. And I'm like, what are you doing with this honey? Are you taking a bath with the honey? And they're like, down in New York City, this is like $70, $80. So all day long, they're paying half the price for it up here because they're making more money right down there. So the money stretches up here. And that's why in each state, the amount of money that you can collect on unemployment fluctuates. So New York is one of the higher states. I think New York, Texas, California, maybe Massachusetts too, are where some, and Ohio, I think maybe are the highest. So other states, though, what they do, and I believe at one time New York considered changing this, was if you, let's say, collected unemployment and you got let's say you got $500 a week, right? That's roughly $100 a day. And you went and you worked 2 days. Well, they would say, hey, listen, here's what we're going to do. We're just going to give you $300 this week. But in New York State, they don't do that. At least, if they've made that change, it's been pretty recent because they didn't do that. But this sounds like it's really good news for a lot of people that are unemployed. And, if you guys know anybody that's unemployed or your family's unemployed, within days, right? We're talking about within a week, people are going to be seeing, maybe a couple $1,000s between unemployment and the stimulus stuff. Now, there was, and I really want you guys to chime in on this. I really do. Our two U.S. senators, right? Our two senators that represent New York State in the United States Senate, Chuck Schumer and Kirsten Gillibrand. Chuck Schumer is the highest ranking Democrat in the Senate. He is the minority leader in the Senate. And he has proposed a mighty plan. So, on top of the $1,200 stimulus money that you would get, if you are what he is calling a frontline essential worker, police officer, firefighter, nurse, doctor, what have you, he wants to give you a $25,000 hazard pay stimulus check. So on top of everything else, the other stimulus, because obviously if you're working as an essential frontline worker, you're still getting paid and you're not going to get unemployment. But he wants to cut all these people a $25,000 check. Whoa, right? I mean, we're talking about millions of people across the country that would qualify for this $25,000. That's a lot of money. And, I was talking to my sons about this earlier, what the question is right now. And the real tough, the tough question to answer is, we borrow now to give people money now, hoping that they're going to do the right thing. Okay, Justin, you got it, buddy. That's where I'm going, right? So we give the money now to people, but we've got to borrow it. And one day we've got to borrow that money back or pay that money back. And again, one of the ways that we do this is we do it in the form of bonds. So we float bonds, right? And we do this not like, sometimes people buy bonds, right? But oftentimes we're floating these bonds out to other countries. So, the government will say, okay, here's a bond. We're going to give you a bond for $1 million, right? Japan, you give us $250,000 today, and in 20 years, you're going to come back with this bond, and we're going to give you $1 million. How many of these bonds do you want to buy, right? Japan says, okay, well, sell us, 1,000 of those bonds, right? So then one day they're going to come back, and if my calculations are correct, right, they're going to want billions. I think it would then work out to be $2.5 billion that they're going to come back and just from them. So where are we going to get that money? And that's where we've come as a country, guys, is that we now borrow money to pay back the money that we've borrowed before. And not only do we do this on a federal or national level, I should say a national level, but Americans are getting trapped into this. And people have been getting trapped into this for years. People are saddled with student loan debt. They're saddled with credit card debt. They have more credit card debt than they have savings. Very few Americans truly have savings accounts anymore. And that's because they take that credit card out, they max that credit card out. Then, because they've gotten used to that lifestyle, they go get another credit card, and they're paying off the first credit card while they're throwing things on the second credit card. And that's what we've been doing as a country. At some point, it's going to stop. At some point, other countries are going to say, yeah, America, we're done lending to you, right? And then what do we do? Because we can't print money. We've talked about this plenty of times in class. You can't print money to save the economy. right? You then devalue the money and it's worthless. So, yeah, I don't know. $25,000 for every essential frontline worker. And again, how do we label that, right? Who's really an essential frontline worker? I don't know. I don't know where we draw the line. If and let me make my case, okay? Um, if a nurse and a doctor are working in an emergency room and they are being um, exposed, right, to COVID-19, well, what about the custodian that has to clean that emergency room? Aren't they then an essential frontline worker? Shouldn't, if we're going to give that emergency room nurse, he or she, $25,000, shouldn't we then give the person that then has to clean up everything that they do that same amount of money? What about the security guards that are guarding the hospitals and guarding the emergency rooms and keeping people from coming in and out? I had to bring my dad just to a doctor's office, and there were 6 people at the front door, and they had this like laser thing that they put on our foreheads to take our temperature, and I think they shined a light in our eyes or something, and they just kind of they had us like lift up our heads, and they just kind of took a look at us, right? So, are these people frontline, essential workers? Are they going to get the $25,000? So I don't know. I guess they're going to debate it over the next few days in the Senate. But holy moly, that's a lot of money, right? That's a lot of cheddar. And where, like Justin said, okay, yeah, but where is that money going to come from now? Right. Well, this 2.2 trillion we have to borrow, right? Or we have to put out in bonds. And I don't know. I don't know where we would get that money from. As it is, the $600 that we're giving out to people that are collecting on unemployment, where does the state get that money, right? Well, the federal government said they're going to reimburse. So that's part of that $2.2 trillion. New Yorkers are going to get that extra $600. New York is going to put it up. We're going to say, okay, we've got the cash now. We'll put it up, and then the federal government, then we're going to send the federal government a bill, and then they're going to write us a check. So, yeah, interesting, right? I don't know. I don't know that that's got a chance to get passed. That's an exorbitant amount of money. So last night, and this is something that I really haven't thought about. Last night, we talked about how African Americans are at a higher risk of getting the coronavirus than white Americans. And part of the reason is because, over the years, over generations, they have had less access to good healthcare, quality healthcare. Generations of African Americans have probably lived most of their lives without any type of healthcare. And we know today, like African Americans are predisposed to diabetes and heart care or heart conditions. I said heart conditions. But this is one of the things I didn't think about. And let's take a look at these numbers. So in New York City, if you look at all the people that have died in New York City alone, 34% of them are Hispanic. 28% of them are Black. 28% of them are Black. 27% of them are white, and 7% are Asian. So in New York City, if you look at all the people that have died, 34% Hispanic, 28% Black, 27% white, 7% Asian. However, if you go out of New York City, if you come to upstate and all the outlying areas, 14% are Hispanic that have died, 18% are Black, 62% are white, 4% are Asian. So in these densely populated areas, this is where Black and Hispanic people the percentage of them that are dying is higher than white and Asians, but in outside of New York City, it's mostly white. And why? Well, if we look at the people that are getting hit in those urban areas, these are people that don't have great access to healthcare. They're people that are on the front line. They are some of these essential workers, but they are people that work jobs that, don't provide healthcare and are directly, jobs that are being exposed. So, and these are a lot of the people that still have to work right now. They're cleaners. They're people that are doing all these menial jobs, I guess we can call them, that we deem essential. But how do we pay them? Right? They're paid like crapola. And they're certainly not being given health care. Maybe if they work in a hospital, they're given health care. But so that the governor talked about this quite a bit today. And it's all because of demographics and urban area versus rural area versus suburban area, right? And even like in our state, we have densely populated urban area, inner city urban area of New York City. And even though Albany is urban, it's not like New York City, right? It's not urban like New York. So here's another thing. How we doing? Oh, we're running a little late, but that's okay. So this was a little scary to me, my friends, and I texted it out to some friends of mine once I read it. The Latham BK, the Latham BK, if you know what I'm talking about, the BK Lounge, has now they know that one of their cashiers has tested positive and has been working. So if you are in the Latham area, I would not go to BK. That's a little scary, and that's one of the reasons, like the few times that I've gone out, like I love a good Dunkin' Donuts coffee, don't get me wrong, but yeah, I'm not swinging by, right? I'm not doing it. I'm a little afraid to go through. What else do we have? So Bernie Sanders has not dropped out of the campaign. He's suspended his campaign. And I guess he has said that, he is suspending it. He is not totally out of it. He is holding on to his delegates for the moment. So I don't know if he's trying to play some game to kind of let the dust settle here. But, Joe Biden seems like he's going to be the Democratic nominee right now. Broadway, and Governor Cuomo got this question today, and he kind of was like, meh. He got this question. Apparently, Broadway has announced that they are going to remain closed for another 2 months. And when he was asked the question, he was kind of like, really, Broadway? Really? For 2 more months. They closed for 2 more months. They're not going to open back up until June. But he really, I don't think he said something like, I like going to a good play, but, we got bigger fish to fry right now. We got bigger fish to fry than getting, I don't know, whatever, Hamilton back up and running. Now, here's one of the coolest things that I think I've seen. And I really, really like this, okay? Stuyvesant Plaza, the owner of Stuyvesant Plaza. And don't get me wrong, you guys, Justin, I'm a theater guy. My kids are theater guys. I love the theater. I love going to a good play. But I kind of agree with the governor right now. Like, we want that business to get up and running. But, I don't know who's really going to it right now or who would go to it. If somebody gave me free front row tickets to go see, the best Broadway play of the year, I'm not so sure I would go take it, take the seats. But anyways, real cool. So, Stuyvesant Plaza, the owners of Stuyvesant Plaza have gone to their restaurants and purchased $10,000 in gift cards from the restaurants in the plaza because they want to help those different restaurants. And then what they're going to do, at least this is what I read earlier today, is they are going to give those gift cards out to healthcare workers. So, classy move, okay? Super, super classy move. These are the types of things that I like to see. When I hear something like this, I'm like, you know what? That makes me want to go to Stuyvesant Plaza. It makes me want to go and give my patronage to businesses there. So they're doing the right thing. They're helping their restaurants that are there in the plaza, and then they're going to go and they're going to, give, these gift cards to people that really need the help. Right now, that you think about some of these nurses and doctors, they're working 10, 12, 14-hour shifts. Well, now I can call over to Blaze Pizza or whatever and get my pizza, and I don't have to go home and worry about working. I can just pick up my dinner. I can go home, shower, boom, eat dinner, and I don't have to cook, and I can get a good night's rest and then go back to work for another 12 hours, right? So classy move, classy move, Stuyvesant Plaza. Okay, my friends, we're running a little late, but let's do this day in history. So April 8th, this day in history, in 1832, 300 soldiers left Fort Jefferson and began the start of the Black Hawk War. In U.S. history, you should have learned, and we had talked about, unfortunately, it was kind of, as things were kind of falling apart, what was happening between white Americans and Native Americans, Indians out west. And, what a shame of what happened, our belief that, this white dominance in our country, that white European settlers had the right to do whatever they needed to do to push to the Pacific Ocean. And, for, about 60 years, not only did settlers, but the U.S. Army waged war on the Native American tribes. On this day in 1865, General Robert E. Lee is cut off at Appomattox Courthouse. And in the next few days, we'll talk about the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, where Lee hands over and surrenders his army to his old friend, Ulysses Grant. In 1913, we talked about our state senators earlier. In 1913, on this day, the 17th Amendment is passed. And the 17th Amendment, prior to the 17th Amendment, the way state U.S. senators representing a state, the way they were picked is that the state assemblies and the state senates would then pick those people. So it became a very corrupt affair, as you might imagine. So the 17th Amendment changed that, and the 17th Amendment said, now we as New Yorkers, we don't vote for people that vote for them. We directly vote for our senators. And this happens during the Progressive era. On this day in 1935, the WPA is another program that FDR starts, and Congress approves the WPA, which is another program that takes people, puts people to work, gets them working, gets them a paycheck, gets them buying and paying, paying and buying the things that they need, and they get a little paycheck for it. Let's see. In 1952, we talked about in this last unit in U.S., we talked about the government really stepping up with these railroad strikes, and they step up on the side of workers. And then on the side of businesses. But after Theodore Roosevelt becomes president, presidents start to step up, and they get involved in these strikes to really help the worker and not the business. And on this day in 1952, now that I'm thinking about it, it's got to be towards the end of his presidency. It's got to be pretty close. Yeah. President Truman seizes steel mills and will eventually, because of um, the strife of all the workers, so he seizes them to step in and try to settle all these problems. 1974. I'm not a big baseball fan, but I thought I'd throw this in there. On this day in 1974, Hank Aaron cracks Babe Ruth's home run record. So on this day, Hank Aaron, 1974, he breaks Babe Ruth's home run record. So for your baseball fans out there, I threw one in there for you. Last but not least, on this day in 1993, the first Latino female astronaut goes into space. Ellen Ochoa. I think I'm saying her name right. Ochoa. Um, so there's a little bit of an eclectic, group of history here, but there's a couple, Hank Aaron and this Ellen Ochoa, that are, certainly groundbreakers in their fields. I mean, Hank Aaron, I don't know, he certainly wasn't the first African American to play the game, but to break Babe Ruth's record was certainly an astonishing feat. So, we're at an interesting place, my friends. We may be at the plateau of this. We might be, really starting to see the curve flattening. But I think a lot of people this week, are kind of like, or just kind of like holding their breath and waiting and to see what happens. And I think I am too. Today, I felt like I was in kind of a weird mood all day. Excuse me, but we'll get there. I really do think by the end of the week we'll start to have a little bit of a better idea. And even I think some of the information coming out of the federal government seems to indicate that yes, their models were wrong. They may have greatly overestimated the amount of people that may pass away from this. But it's even the reporters tonight with the president, they asked him, they said, when are you willing to call this over? When are you willing to say, we're on the other end of it and we're ready to go back to business as usual? And he didn't really even go near the question. He did the typical politician spin, and I don't blame him. I think coming out of this, we're just going to really need to be 100% sure. And I've said this to a couple people, if we come back early and one person has it and they walk into cafeteria B, period 5, think about that. Think about how quickly that would then start to spread. So, I still think we're still, well, we're like, we've said it every night, we're still running the marathon. Let's not sprint through this. Things are feeling a little weird this week, but I don't think it's a bad weird. I just think it's one of those weirds where you're just kind of like, something, please happen. And we've just kind of hit a lull. So, there's still a lot of good stuff happening out there. There's a lot of really good stories of people doing good work. This thing with Stuyvesant Plaza really brought a smile to my face today. And, I'm hoping to see more things like that come as we go through it. So, but anyways, hey, we got through another chapter tonight of The Jungle, and we have a married couple, and now we're kind of flashing back to about a year. I think it was about a year earlier, and they first getting here to America. So some really cool stuff happening in that book. It's been a long time since I've read it, and I'm happy to be rereading it with you guys again. So have a great night, everybody, and I'll see you tomorrow. Tomorrow's Thursday, right? So we'll read tomorrow night and Friday. We'll take Saturday off, and we'll we'll revisit and come back on Sunday. But be good, and I'll see everybody tomorrow night.